And now on to our main topic. We are looking at Chapter 7 of the 5th edition Player's Handbook,
Mhm.
using ability scores. So, as we continue our look at 5e, we've been going through the Player's Handbook and talking about design elements and what we might change or what we like or what the future of D&D might be along these lines. And we are now to ability scores and modifiers. And again, I sometimes as we're going through these chapters, I look and I say, we're not going to be able to discuss anything cool. This is pretty basic stuff. I don't know what we're going to say. And then as I start to think about it more, I'm like, okay, this is super important. And there's some fun things that we can talk about.
It's
So,
also
and ability
can I
scores
just
are one of those things.
it's also like when you think about it, you're like, "Wait, this is chapter 7," yet it feels sort of fundamental to the game,
Yeah.
but they've told us enough about it that the previous chapters sort of worked, and those were all focused on character creation. So now it's like we're even all the way in chapter 7, and they go, "Hey, here's how to really play through the game," which is a fascinating thing, right?
Yeah. And I think it makes sense in if you are trying to just get new players into the game, the information they get about creating a character does its job, and
Mhm.
then you can later get into these details
Yeah.
which they do here. But I wanted to focus on ability scores themselves. And I
Mhm.
don't know if we actually went through them when we talked earlier about what do these scores mean? Do we need them all? Can we make a better game, or what your idea of a better game is, by either adding some or subtracting some from what's currently there? If you played long enough, you just take for granted that these are what they are.
Right? The 6
Um,
scores.
and
Mhm.
right, are we to the point now where we can step back and forget we're D&D fans and forget we've been playing since first edition or whatever edition you started with, and say this could be different and maybe better.
Bring back
So
comeliness, you
let's
mean?
talk about yeah. So what Teos mentioned there was a first edition stat that was added called comeliness, and it was essentially your attractiveness at first glance,
Mhm.
um, as if you can put a rating on that or really anything. Uh, but it
Yeah.
was a way to get an instant reaction from someone in the game. You could
Mhm.
add a modifier if you were, super comely, and or a horror effect even if
Yeah.
you had such a low score, that you could horrify people to the point where you're almost like a dragon,
Yeah.
terrifying them. And so that was a 7th score that was in the game at the end of first edition. It came in with the Unearthed Arcana,
Yeah, it's not a fan
book.
favorite these days for many obvious reasons. But yeah, I mean, it tells us that
Yeah.
well, even D&D has had times when it played around with these, and so I think you're saying, could we like take some off or change how they work or?
Or add some. Or add
Hmm.
some, yeah, no, for me, it would be take some off, take
Yeah.
some away. But it could be if your
Mm.
game is more super, you wanna be super specific about what these things mean and have a different way of gauging them, that you might split, constitution into health and endurance, right? Or
Hmm.
something like that. I'm just
Yeah,
throwing
yeah.
out ideas that you might want, if you want something new. So I've I'm fascinated by the idea of a stat dump, right? A dump
Hmm.
stat that is so not used in the game that anyone can just put the lowest score in that, and it really won't hurt them. And another question I ask is, if it's just an average commoner that doesn't have a race, doesn't have a class, doesn't have any special abilities, doesn't have to worry about saving throws or attack rolls, what scores are important to them?
Yeah.
And for me, yeah, charisma used to be the dump stat
Hmm.
in first edition because no attacks, nothing of major importance was tied to it when you're in the dungeon. it could become important if you were dealing with henchmen or dealing with those sorts of things, but so few people use those rules that it really didn't matter. Or you could just have one character who took just enough that they didn't get a horrible penalty to it,
Right.
and then they were the ones that always dealt with the henchmen, so you didn't have your treasure bearers leaving in the middle of an adventure.
And your
Um,
saving throws weren't based
yeah,
on ability scores, right? Which also helped, right? You were doing saving throws like rod, wands, and
yeah,
staves, so it wasn't breath weapon, right? It was
right.
totally different. Yeah,
Yeah. It was based on your class rather
right.
than any stats. And even well, I'll get to that in a minute. So, if you, Teos, were to choose one um, stat that you would consider a dump stat in
Mm.
5e, what would it be?
Well, it's depending on the character, right? So if I'm building a non-cast, well,
Forget,
sure.
yeah,
Well, strength
forget
or
classes
dex,
in
usually
general.
strength or dex, you can dump one of the two, regardless of,
Mhm.
one of those can easily be
Right.
dumped. In fact, I'd argue that 5e almost has too many possible dump stats. So strength is a common one unless you need it. Charisma is still pretty
Mhm.
easy to dump. Int is very easy to dump,
Yeah.
right? It's almost like they've gone the opposite of fourth edition and third edition, which tried to limit making dump stats, and there are a number of them. But intelligence is a common one because it doesn't have a skill basis as it used to before, right? Where it created the number of
Mhm.
skills you had, and it comes up very seldom in saving throws. So int is one that's fairly common as a dump stat. I don't know. What would you pick?
Yeah. I would pick strength. I would pick
Mm.
strength as a dump stat. Because if you're not attacking anything with a big weapon,
Mm-hmm.
um, and you're not worried about encumbrance, which a lot of games don't,
Mm-hmm.
there aren't a lot of spells that call for strength saving throws.
Right.
Uh, there are ways to get around almost everything that strength does, including escaping from a grapple.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so it's, oddly, strength is
Right.
used to be the most important stat
Yeah.
for most classes or for most characters, and now it's almost the least to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, yeah, no, a
But
lot of my
what they
characters
did
have
with, yeah,
that dumb stat.
including fighters,
Mhm.
right? Because you just pump
Unless
up
you're
your
going with the
dex, you
two-handed
get the
weapon, right?
bonus,
Then
right?
yeah.
Yep. Bumping up your strength gives you better armor class, generally better initiative
And
uh
and it's fascinating
checks.
what games did rather than try to change the ability scores where they would try to address this in different ways. Like third edition would have strength bows, right? Where the best bows required
Yep.
a strength score to use them because they're compound bows and So
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
yeah, they'd come through those hoops and yeah. So what do you think? What would you do here with these ability scores? What would you if you're looking at a
It,
new edition? What would you want to change?
uh, if you want to make the game easier to understand, get rid of as many as you
Mm,
can. Tie your spell casting. Yeah, right. You have two stats. You have spell casting and you have fighting,
mm-hmm. Fighting, talking,
and you
spellcasting could
can,
be.
right, sure, and you could do lots of different things with it. It would make it much easier to understand. If you were choosing a spellcasting class, you would just use your spellcasting
Mm-hmm.
ability score. If you
Yeah,
were doing fighting, you would do your fighting ability score. Now, again, I this is just one way you could do
yeah.
it based on the goal of making it as easy to understand for new players as possible. I could also see, like I said earlier, making six more
Mm-hmm.
ability scores and tying different things to those, which would give the sort of bookkeeping realist player a way to say, well, charisma could mean how good you look or how well you interact with others or how strong a will you have. So therefore, I want those three things. I want willpower, looks, and socialization,
That's
right?
how you end up
Rather
with the
than just
complete
charisma.
handbook too,
And
and then each ability score gets its own
it,
handbook.
exactly. Now, which is better? It depends on what you as the DM or player want. Uh, so it's not what's better; it's what would happen if
Yeah.
you did do these things,
Let me ask you another one.
and make. Yeah, go ahead.
No, no, we'll finish that thought. Sorry, if you want to.
I don't even remember what I was going to
Okay.
say. I
So
think it
let me ask
was,
a bit.
yeah.
So one thing is which ability scores, and I think we could all probably pick favorites. Like to me, I'd collapse intelligence and wisdom. But another thing is
Mhm.
that in fifth edition, the ability scores have a maximum of 20 and monsters a maximum of
Mhm.
30. Do you like that range? Do you think that's a pretty good range?
Yeah, I don't mind that range because that's not about modeling what a character's like. That's
Mhm.
not a story thing. That's a math thing.
Yeah, it's a
So I
bounded
think
accuracy.
yeah, yeah. So I think the math works
Hmm.
out the way the game needs it to, keeping it at a +5 for a score of 20, and then with your proficiency bonus only going up to a certain thing, you've got the right range. And I like that sort of,
Yeah.
bounded range more.
What about the every 2 points is a plus up or down, right? So 10 is 0, and then if you have an 11, nothing happens, and when it's a 12, it's +1. Would you toy with that odd number not giving you anything?
Well, I think we've discussed this before,
A
right?
little
We
bit,
would
yeah.
just get rid
That's
of the
true.
plus. We would get rid of the number and just use the bonus.
Well,
And
yeah,
in that sense,
that's true.
you would sort of have to say
Yeah,
you only add one and you don't worry about the half
yeah,
step. And the half
yeah,
step can have its uses if the math works out right. But again, it's just one more little wrinkle that's you have to explain.
yeah.
And it's just one little wrinkle you have to explain. But if you have to explain 72 small wrinkles,
Right.
that adds up to several big wrinkles in the long run.
Yeah, and here they give us a in fact they tackle this because they say, here's the quick method. Subtract 10 from your score, divide the total by 2. So if you have like an 18, take 10 off of it, that's 8, divide by 2, it's +4 bonus, right? But like they even have to tell you that so that you don't think as a new player that you got to look at this chart the whole time. I think most of us have just memorized it probably as much as anything else. Um, and then the next part here is advantage and disadvantage.
Mhm.
So the
Yeah.
rule,
So of course yeah. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
well, so there's a couple interesting parts, right? If something opposes advantage or disadvantage, you roll a second die and take the higher or lower of that, depending on which situation it was. If you have both situations, they cancel out, and it doesn't matter how many of them you have on either side. So if you have 3 disadvantage and 1 advantage, doesn't matter, cancels out. It's not like they are playing a game back and forth to see what you end up with. If you have a reroll, you can reroll your choice of one of the dice that resulted from advantage or disadvantage. And then we're told, how do you get it? You gain it through the use of special abilities, actions, or spells. Inspiration can also give a character advantage based on, and then you can give it based on various circumstances that you think should impose one or the other.
Yeah. The At the beginning of 5e, the biggest controversy that I remember having to deal with at the table were rogues with advantage and disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
Because sneak attack tells you that you can, if you have advantage, you can get sneak attack. Or if you're standing next to, if your target is standing next to an ally, you can have it. And it says you cannot do sneak attacks if you have disadvantage. And everyone would say, well, I have advantage for this reason and disadvantage for this reason. Since I have disadvantage, I can't get sneak attack, or you can't get sneak attack. And I would have to go to the rule where it says if you have both, you have neither.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, if you are standing next to someone, if your target's standing next to someone, you
Right.
still can do sneak attack because you no longer have the disadvantage. And such fights would break out at tables, especially with DM saying no, you can't, and the players of Rogue saying yes, I can. and not even knowing why they were making that argument. They were just making it because they wanted sneak attack.
Yeah.
So we'd have to, go to that page and then this page and show them how it all stacked up. Um,
Hmm.
so, it's pretty common sense, but when you start interacting with these other rules, it can become a little bit more
Yeah.
complicated than it needs to be.
Yeah, I generally like it. I think it's a very nice way to gauge situations, and certainly advantage and disadvantage are fantastic ways to get rid of the many bonuses and penalties the game used to track in previous editions.
Mhm.
So I like all of that, but it is a little heavy compared to some bonuses. Like flanking was a smaller bonus in the past, and so it was sort of felt nicer to kind of add these, or higher ground, +1 for higher ground, things like that. And a lot of those things you now can't do because it's just advantage would be too much and it would drive play. If higher
Mhm.
ground gave you advantage, everybody would seek higher ground. And you see this in tables where they want
Mhm.
advantage, they want to flank to get advantage, right? And that's an optional rule, not a core rule, for that
Right.
reason. That's just, it would drive behavior so strongly. The other thing is that if you have it from so many sources, now it removes the use of those sort of hard fought ways to grant someone advantage go away. And I think I saw this in one D&D. There was something that let you get advantage, and I thought to myself, well, that's, you know, normally in gameplay, someone's working hard to give you that, and now you can just give it to yourself. It's gonna erode the value of that, right? And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting because other games use other mechanics to let you succeed at a cost if you really, really, really want to succeed. And so, in Fate, you use a fate point,
Hmm.
and therefore there's a much, much better chance you're going to succeed at what you're trying to do. And
Yeah.
that's the story's currency to let that happen. And it feels like advantage is that thing in D&D, only there's no cost for it. It's we want generally advantage works out to somewhere between +4 and +5 on a roll mathematically. It depends
Yeah.
on what
It
the target
depends.
number is,
Yeah.
but that's
Hmm.
it's generally in that
Around
range
there.
for
Yep.
most normal DCs. Um, so with a 20 to 25% increased chance of succeeding with checks that are generally pretty likely to succeed in the first place. Advantage is one of those things where you're very likely to succeed if you have it.
Yeah.
So I like it in that sense, but it's just, as you say, so easy to get sometimes that
Hmm.
it turns into a, well, it's all about getting advantage rather than playing the game and telling the story, just like the
Yeah.
flanking, when that was not an optional rule, turned into, if I can't flank, I'm not even gonna bother attacking.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
that
for sure.
sort of I've had that happen at 4E tables,
Yeah.
uh, where they just like, "I can't flank, I'm not even gonna bother because I want my sneak attack, or I want this extra special thing to
Sure.
happen because I have advantage." So, um, it, uh, it seems very strong, and I would love the disadvantage to have a more
Hmm.
um story focused connection to the game as opposed to just mechanical, but
Yeah.
then you're getting into some design space that would be uncomfortable for a lot of the players who are just used to, I'm standing here, or I use this ability, so therefore I have advantage.
Um, so let's move on just in the interest of time. Proficiency bonus is the next section. This is really interesting in that it's another fundamental piece to the game. It's the math that drives the advancement over time that characters and creatures have. It's what allows your bounded accuracy to also work by putting some caps on how good you get to be at things. Previous editions have had things like you based on your class, you would get, bonus to your attacks, and then skills might be based on your ability score. And now we get this underlying proficiency bonus, and so it's a bonus based on your level that is being added to all of your abilities. Monsters have it too. The rules for that are in the Dungeon Master's Guide for how that kind of stretches across as they get stronger. They have higher proficiency bonuses, and you add it only once to a roll, so again limits stacking. represents you have a proficiency in some aspects. So it's also the trained, not trained piece. In a lot of ways, it's really kind of
Mhm.
amazing, right? It's really well done from a lot of perspectives. Do you have any bones to pick with proficiency bonus?
I don't. I think, as you said, it's a much more elegant uh, way to deal with something that D&D has dealt with bizarrely in the past. With first edition, it was the THACO charts based on your class.
Yeah.
Uh, and with fourth edition, it was half your level, right? You got
Hmm.
to add to your armor class, your other things. So that's how
Right.
fourth edition dealt with it, which the number range was much wider then.
Yeah.
So
And
I like the lower math.
it felt in
Yeah.
fourth edition. I don't mind this, but a lot of people do. It felt like, you gain a level and the world gains a level. And so it was always the only way to make things
Mhm.
work was for the world to sort of dance and step with you, which I'm fine because I don't mind that meta. To me, like I'm fine if the lock DC changes every level. I don't really have a problem, but a lot of people do. They're like, hey, no, locks are DC 15. So, you should just be able to open all the locks. And I'm like, well, I don't know. Somebody can make a better lock. But it's that kind of thing. And proficiency
Mhm.
bonus takes away a lot of this discussion and makes it just kind of operate smoothly in the background, which is pretty cool.
Yep, I'm happy with the math of 5e, and proficiency bonus has a lot to do with that. So, mwah,
Yeah.
kudos on that.
And similarly, we see a section on ability checks. This does a number of things. The first thing it does is it says, hey, here's a table of typical difficulties ranging from 5 to 30. 5 is very easy, 15 is medium, and nearly impossible is 30. It tells you, roll a d20, add the relevant ability modifier. If you're proficient, you add that and check against the DC. We get rules for contests as opposed checks, and it has a nice way of writing it that it says a tie results in no change from the current position. So if you're struggling over a door and you're trying to open the door and it's currently closed, if you tie, nothing changes. And if it's open and you're trying to close it, well, if you tie, nothing changes. And I like that a lot. Um, and then they talk through all of the different skills and the different ways that you can use these various skills, as well as passive checks. Any comments on this section?
Mhm. Yeah, just a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I could go on for a while about this. So the idea that a DC 10 check is easy has
Mm,
always sort of grinded my gears, because if something's easy, then everyone should pretty much be able to do it most of the time. And a DC 10 means, unless you're proficient in whatever you're trying to do, or have an innate skill for it, you're failing 50% of the time,
yeah.
or sorry, 55% of the time. And to me, that doesn't work. And it's not that the math is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
because I do want players to have to make DC 5 checks sometimes, because the absolute humor in a group
Yeah,
of people failing a DC 5 check is amazing.
it's true.
And but I'm also one of those people that, you don't need to roll a die for everything unless it's going to really, really matter. And I want the story to go quick, so I'm not even going to call for a check if it's less than DC 10. Um, if I'm trying to run a game quickly and keep the story moving. So yeah, I'm of two minds about it, but that DC 10 easy has um
Yeah, yeah, I could see that.
always bothered me.
Mm-hmm.
But
Well,
that's it.
yeah,
That's all I've got about it.
yeah. Passive checks are interesting. I think that's got some interesting to it where you sometimes it leads to people wanting to press the I win button by figuring out how to, especially
Mm.
with passive perception, always spot every trap, which gets into the nebulous way in which how a trap is found is described in both the player's handbook and DMG, which is it investigation, is it perception? What does it
Yep.
mean? Um, and even more controversial was when Jeremy Crawford on the D&D Dragon Talk podcast said all skills can be passive and they represent a floor which you would never go below. And it's like, I think every DM just said, well, I'm going to pretend I didn't hear that.
Yeah.
And so it's no surprise that one D&D seems to maybe get rid of passives or change passives because I think those are some problematic angles to the game.
Right. The worst part of that for me was, yes, as the DM, I'm like, but I like low rolls. And as a
Mhm.
player, I love low rolls sometimes.
Mhm.
But, what that really said to me was that the people who make Wizards of the Coast don't care about skills,
Mm.
right? Because you
Yeah.
don't say, well, like a passive strength saving throw or a passive attack roll,
Yeah.
right? You can't just assume you rolled a 10 for your attack roll, or you can't
Right.
feel like, well, let's just say I rolled a 10 and that's the floor for my dexterity saving throw. Now, you could
Yeah.
make a game like that,
Right, right.
and a game like that might even be okay, but that's not what I want from D&D. I want there to be that,
Active
um,
engagement.
that
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and in previous editions, the kind of the way this would slip into the rules, I think it may have even been in like the rules compendium or something like that, but it was certainly in third and in fourth, as sort of the idea of, hey, if I were doing something long enough, I could just assume that I'm taking 10 on it, right? That I'm going to get a 10, I'm going to get an
Mhm.
average result. So it's 10 plus whatever your bonus is.
Right.
You could call it taking 10. And you could even say taking 20 in certain situations in certain editions. But that idea of sort of averaging out the result, and what 5e is trying to do on one hand, but then goes beyond that concept. It's trying to say, hey, if a creature is, standing on guard, two bugbears on guard, are they going to see you sneaking up? And there's two ways to handle that. One is opposed checks, but then you could end up with sort of a
Mhm.
random roll situation, which I don't have a problem at all, and I think you don't have a
Right.
problem at all. But D&D was saying, why don't we just standardize it that the bugbears have a sort of static number of alertness, and that's their passive
Mhm.
perception, and you're trying to
Right.
stealth against that. And I love the logic of that, but it then becomes, when it goes to the side where the player can say nobody can sneak up on me ever. No trap will ever go
Right.
undetected ever because of what I can do with the rules of the game. That's where I go, well, and
Right.
that's not why we play. This is eroding why we play.
Right. Right. Exactly. We play for your character's unique and the situations are unique, and that uniqueness isn't always positive. Sometimes that
Mhm.
uniqueness is something going horribly wrong because of a die roll or because
Yeah.
of just who your character is, and that needs to be okay. That needs to
Yeah.
be a part of D&D for me.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. We get some things on the help action. We've talked about that in past and other ways. Group checks. Everyone makes the check. At least half the group succeeds. The whole group succeeds. That's awesome. And then we just get really into
Mhm.
the section using each ability that walks through every ability, and kind of different ways to do it, examples of play, things like that. Even some variant rules, which are sort of interesting. What if you want to use encumbrance as a variant? Um,
Mhm.
there's also the part that talks about how you can use as a variant skills with different abilities. So you can say things like strength intimidation instead of charisma always being tied to intimidation.
Right.
But it's listed as a variant, which is interesting. Um,
Mhm.
and then at the very end is just saving throws that closes down to the section, which just really tells you here's how to do it. And the difficulty
Mhm.
class comes from whatever is causing it. It'll state it. So you're just rolling a d20 and your modifier. That's it.
Yep. The only thing I would change about saving throws is make more things that call on other. It's all
Yeah.
dex or it's all wisdom. Little strength thrown in, sometimes con thrown in, rarely charisma or intelligence, right? Let's make spells and things that
Yeah.
target those um and allow players to take advantage of that and allow um, DMs to take advantage of that a little bit more than they do.
Yeah. Agreed.
So we good with chapter 7?
I think so.
All
What's
right.
next is
Well, that
adventuring.
is a
Ooh,
show. Ooh, I love adventuring, but that's just me.
I've been known to like it.
So, with that, yes, with that, we want to thank our patrons for helping us keep this show going. Thank you to our Master of Dungeons supporters. There's a special shout out to our Master of Realms supporters in our show notes. And we want to thank On air are masters of the multiverse: Craig Bailey, Steve Bissonette, John Carney, Darren Chandler, Robin Derme, Andy Edmonds at nerdronomicon.com, Ben F., Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Brian King, Travis Lee, Eric Menge, Nianakra, Falcon Neal, Drago Russo, Krishna Simonse, David Somerville of the Planegea RPG setting, Joe Tyler, and Graham Ward. And thank you too to all of our listeners. If you like the show, we would love it if you would consider becoming a patron by going to patreon.com/masteringdnd. Teos, you know what I'm going to ask. Where can people find you?
Well, on Crunch Monster, I'm Alpha Stream. I'm also Alpha Stream on Master Gondor and Substack and on your favorite Slack channel. So, or on Twitter. But
Yeah.
really, find me best at alphastream.org. What about you, Shawn?
You can still find me on Twitter, the one place on social media where I will always be as this ship goes down.
Is that
You can
still
find
on?
me on Twitter at Shawn Merwin. Yeah, yeah. And you can also find the podcast at Mastering DND. If Twitter does go down, then we will tell you where else that you can find us.
Yep.
You can always find us on Patreon, of course. I already given you that. And you can leave comments on our spiffy new YouTube channel, the Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel, where we divide the podcast into two, into the questions and news segment and then into the main discussion segment. So thank you for all the support again for those who have subscribed on YouTube. So Teos, we've got a big week ahead of us. It's going to be Thanksgiving when this show drops. So what are we going to do now?
Oh, let's go delete some monsters like they were Dragon Plus.
Oh, that's harsh. Pass the cranberries.
Mm.